You think you know Peter Griffin? Think again. Today, we're diving into Peter's most shocking, messed up moment. So, here's where things kick off. Peter's hanging out at the Drunken Clam with Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe, and they're just doing what they usually do. Chilling, drinking, and talking about whatever random things come up. Cleveland's wife, Loretta, calls him, and Peter's ears perk up. Loretta checks in on Cleveland, asking the usual stuff, and Cleveland, as polite and calm as ever, answers her with total respect. Now, to Peter, this whole scene just doesn't sit right. He thinks Cleveland's way too soft and lets Loretta boss him around. Of course, Peter doesn't keep this thought to himself. He starts teasing Cleveland about it. Peter, being Peter, can't resist poking at Cleveland, saying he needs to man up and stand up to Loretta. Joe and Quagmire join in, egging Cleveland on, and Cleveland just laughs it off like he always does. But Peter, he's on a mission now. In his mind, Cleveland needs to toughen up, and Peter's just the guy to make it happen. So, Peter gives Cleveland some advice on how to deal with Loretta. And if you know Peter, you know this advice isn't exactly practical or sane.
No, I mean, I'm just saying, I thought friends hang out, do things with each other.
He suggests Cleveland stop listening to Loretta's nagging and take control of his own life. Cleveland just nods along, clearly not planning to take Peter's words seriously. But for Peter, this becomes a project. He has to get Cleveland to be a man. It's like Peter's got this weird responsibility to help Cleveland, even though no one asked him to. Fast forward a bit. Peter's out in the neighborhood, probably doing something random, when he hears some strange noises coming from Cleveland's house.
Hey, do you hear that?
What?
Sounds like someone's screaming.
What is it, boy? What are you trying to say?
It sounds like Loretta is screaming.
Trouble at the old mill?
Now, anyone else might ignore it. Maybe just assume someone dropped something or that the TV's on too loud. But Peter, he's curious. Way too curious. He decides he needs to investigate. So, he sneaks up to Cleveland's house and peeks through a window. And what does he see? Loretta. And someone else. But not just anyone. It's Quagmire. Yeah, you heard that right. Cleveland's wife is with Quagmire. Peter can hardly believe it. His mind is racing, trying to process what he just saw. He's shocked, and for a split second, he considers keeping it to himself. But this is Peter we're talking about. Keeping secrets, not exactly his strength. He runs off to find Cleveland, Joe, and the rest of the crew, bursting with the news he just found out. The moment he spills the beans, everything shifts. Joe's jaw drops and Quagmire, realizing he's been exposed, tries to cover for himself, throwing out some weak excuses about it being a moment of weakness, or that he couldn't help himself. But Cleveland, he just stands there, frozen, processing what he's just heard. It's like a bomb just went off in his world. You see, Cleveland's always been the loyal, easygoing guy who doesn't cause any drama. But this news, it's more than just shocking. It's heartbreaking. His best friend and his wife, betraying him like this. For Cleveland, this isn't just a betrayal. It's like his whole world is falling apart. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire are his best friends, the guys he spent years hanging out with, laughing with, depending on. And Loretta, she's his wife, his partner. So, for her to cheat on him, and with one of his best friends, no less, it's a nightmare come to life. Cleveland's devastated, but he's also angry. For the first time, we see him letting all those emotions he usually hides bubble to the surface, getting to the next. It's just a normal day in the Griffin household. Peter's lounging around, being his usual overconfident self.
Ever heard of the MacArthur Genius Grant?
Perhaps.
Well, if you qualify as a genius, the foundation will give you a $500,000 grant just to sit around and do whatever you want.
Wow. Imagine what a genius like me could do with all that money.
And talking up his genius ideas. He's got this big ego, convinced that he's smarter than everyone else, even though his actions usually say otherwise. And it's not like his family hasn't noticed. Brian, the family dog, and surprisingly the voice of reason most of the time, rolls his eyes and throws in a sarcastic comment. Lois, Peter's wife, just gives him this "Are you serious?" look. She's clearly had enough of Peter's talk, especially since he always has some outrageous, half-baked scheme up his sleeve. They challenge him, saying that if he's really so smart, he should prove it by taking an actual IQ test. Now, most people might hesitate thinking, what if I don't score as high as I think? But Peter, he's all in. He's got this crazy confidence that convinces him he's going to blow everyone away with his genius score. So, without a second thought, he heads off to take the IQ test, ready to prove that he's a certified genius. When Peter comes back, he's still got that smug grin on his face, already imagining how he'll lord his intelligence over everyone else. But then he gets the results, and it's a complete shock. His IQ score, it's terrible. Not just bad, but low enough to classify him as mentally disabled. This news hits him like a slap to the face. The first few seconds, Peter's just standing there, speechless. You can practically see the gears turning in his head, like he's struggling to understand what just happened. But Peter, being Peter, doesn't stay down for long. Instead of feeling embarrassed or concerned, he flips the situation around in his mind. Suddenly, he's convinced that this diagnosis is actually a good thing. He starts seeing it as a free pass to do whatever he wants. To him, being disabled means he doesn't have to follow any of the usual rules or responsibilities. He even seems to think that he deserves special treatment now. And in true Peter fashion, he decides to take full advantage. So, what does he do? First off, he stops helping around the house entirely. He figures he's off the hook for chores, so he leaves everything for Lois to deal with, from the laundry to taking care of the kids. And it doesn't stop there. Out in public, Peter starts acting even more outrageous than usual. He pulls off stunts he wouldn't have dared before, expecting everyone to just put up with it. In his mind, this diagnosis makes him untouchable. Of course, his family starts to feel the strain. Lois, who's used to cleaning up after Peter's messes, is reaching her breaking point. She's already got her hands full with 3 kids, and now has to deal with Peter acting like an overgrown child, expecting her to do everything. Even the kids are noticing that something's off. Chris, Peter's son, might not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but even he starts seeing that his dad's behavior is getting worse. But the worst part, Peter isn't just embarrassing himself, he's embarrassing his whole family. Every time he pulls one of his stunts, it's like the entire Griffin family has to bear the consequences. Peter's completely oblivious to how his actions affect those around him. Still convinced he can do whatever he wants, tries to pull off another one of his stunts in front of a social worker. He doesn't realize that this is the last straw. The social worker, who's been keeping an eye on his behavior, sees how his free pass mindset is affecting his family, especially the kids. And just like that, things get serious. The social worker decides that Peter's condition makes him unfit to care for his children, and they make a move to take the kids away. This is the moment where everything clicks for Peter. Watching his children get taken away, he finally realizes he's crossed a line. All the slacking, all the wild behavior, all the times he ignored his family's warnings, it's all coming back to bite him. The look on Lois's face says it all. She's heartbroken, and she can't believe that her husband, the father of her children, has put them in this position. It's like Peter's world comes crashing down around him, and for the first time, he understands the full impact of his actions. You can almost feel the panic setting in. Peter realizes that his family means everything to him, and he's messed up so badly that he might lose them for good. All his bravado, his big ego, his I can do whatever I want attitude, it's gone. He's left standing there, completely vulnerable, realizing he has to do something to fix this. But for Peter, this means swallowing his pride and admitting that he was wrong, something he rarely does. So, what does Peter do? He pulls himself together and goes to the social worker, practically begging for another chance. He finally admits that he took things too far, that he let his pride cloud his judgment. He's desperate to prove that he can be a responsible parent and that he won't let his ego get in the way again. After a lot of back and forth, the social worker decides to give him one last shot, and Peter finally gets his kids back. When he returns home, it's clear that he's learned a hard lesson. For the first time, he's genuinely remorseful, and he seems to understand that being a good husband and father means putting his family first, not his own selfish needs. It's one of those rare moments where Peter actually grows as a person, even if it's only a little bit. Then, we get to the big, dramatic finale of the show. It's the moment everyone's been waiting for, and Brooke has to make her choice. Peter's sitting on the edge of his seat, practically shouting at the TV, as if Brian's about to win the lottery or something. But Brian, by now, has figured out the truth about Brooke. He realizes that she's more interested in the spotlight than a real relationship, and he knows he can't go through with this charade any longer. Right before Brooke's big decision, Brian decides to pull her aside and have an honest conversation. He tells her that he thought there was something genuine between them, but he can't keep playing along if it's all just for the cameras. He explains that he wants something real, something meaningful, and he doesn't want to be part of this fake reality show drama anymore. Brooke, taken off guard, just kind of laughs it off. She brushes him off, saying,
"Oh, stop it. It's just TV."
This is all for fun. She doesn't understand why he's getting so serious. To her, this whole thing is just a game, and she's shocked that Brian's taking it personally. For Brian, though, this is a wake-up call. He realizes he deserves more than a relationship that's just for show. So in a bold move, he decides to walk away from the show entirely. Peter, watching this all unfold from home, is in shock. He can't believe Brian just walked away from his chance at fame and love. But as he watches Brian leave the set, something clicks for Peter. He may not fully understand Brian's reasons, but he respects that Brian made a choice to stay true to himself, even if it meant giving up the win. In the end, Brian returns home, a little heartbroken, but relieved to be done with the fake reality TV life. He's learned a valuable lesson about staying true to himself, and he realizes that some things just aren't worth compromising for. And Peter? Well, he might still not fully understand, but he's there to welcome Brian back, and for once, he respects Brian's choice. Getting to the next episode where Peter's on the couch, excited for a big night with his family, ready to dive into one of his all-time favorite events, the Emmy Awards. But instead of getting the full experience,
Family Guy has been around since 1999, and whenever it's time for the Emmys, they don't give us one. I'm sick of it.
hit with what seems like a never-ending stream of bleeped-out words and censored scenes. Picture it. Every joke, every exciting moment, every little bit of drama, all either covered in pixelated squares or completely muted. Peter is not happy about it. And if you know anything about Peter, he's the kind of guy who takes things to extremes. Now, rather than shrugging it off like a normal person, Peter decides he's going to fix the problem himself. Yep, that's right. He decides to create his own TV network, which he calls PTV. Think about that for a second. This is Peter Griffin we're talking about. So, PTV takes off, and pretty soon, it's the talk of the town. Peter's hosting some seriously wild programming, with no filters, no bleeping, and no limits. It's like every bizarre, over-the-top idea he's ever had is suddenly on display for everyone in Quahog. There are absurd game shows, shocking talk segments, and, of course, Peter's signature crude humor everywhere you look. The craziest part, the town actually loves it. People are laughing, they're talking about it. And for a while, it's like Peter's actually managed to give people what they didn't know they wanted. But as the network's popularity grows, the backlash starts brewing. Let's be real. We all know that Peter doesn't exactly have a filter. This is the guy who once threw a kegger in a movie theater, after all. So, of course, things start getting out of hand pretty quickly. The shows get more outrageous, and the content, well, let's just say it's definitely not family-friendly. Even Brian, the family dog, is shocked by some of the things he sees on PTV, and that's saying something. He watches in horror as Peter's stunts just keep getting more offensive and bizarre by the day. Now, enter the FCC. They're not exactly thrilled about Peter's little experiment in television freedom, and they waste no time stepping in. Peter receives a massive fine and a strict warning to either clean up his act or shut PTV down completely. But do you think Peter takes this lying down? No way. In classic Peter style, he takes it as a challenge. He's convinced he's fighting for the right to free entertainment and ramps up his shows even more, as if daring the FCC to come after him. He's airing some of his wildest ideas yet, anything he can think of to push the boundaries, and at this point, he's not just ignoring the FCC, he's practically inviting them to come after him. The more the FCC cracks down, the more Peter seems to dig his heels in. It's like watching a kid who's been told not to touch something, and now that's the only thing they want to do. He's convinced that his viewers want this unfiltered, totally off-the-wall TV, and he's willing to fight to keep it going, no matter what the FCC says. For Peter, it's almost become personal. But here's the kicker. The more Peter fights, the harder the FCC cracks down, and they take things to a level Peter never expected. So now, the FCC isn't just focused on Peter's network anymore. They decide to go all out and start censoring every aspect of life in Quahog.
Filthy shows.
Oh, Lois, you are so full of... What? No, I can't say in my own house? Great, Lois, just great. You know, you're lucky you're good at my or I'd never put up with you.
And I mean everything. Imagine trying to have a normal conversation, and every few words get bleeped out or covered up. People are getting censored for saying basic, everyday stuff, and it turns the whole town into a confusing, laughable mess. Imagine being in a restaurant, trying to order a sandwich, and the waiter's response is filled with bleeps and cutoff words. It's like living in a cartoon version of a dystopian future. At this point, Peter finally starts to realize he might have gone a bit too far. What started as his Freedom of TV campaign has now turned into an all-out nightmare for the entire town. People are fed up, and they're all looking at Peter as the one who caused this chaos. Even Lois, who's usually the one person willing to put up with Peter's nonsense, has had enough. She can't believe that he's let things spiral out of control this badly. The tipping point comes when Peter's family and friends confront him, explaining just how ridiculous their lives have become because of his stubbornness. They can't even have normal conversations anymore, and everyone's just done with it. Peter realizes that his fight for uncensored TV has pretty much backfired in every possible way. It's only now, with the whole town suffering, that he understands there might have been a good reason for those TV rules in the first place. In the end, Peter has to eat a huge slice of humble pie. He shuts down PTV and apologizes to the town, admitting that he maybe, just maybe, took things a little too far. The FCC finally lifts the ridiculous restrictions, and life in Quahog returns to normal. But Peter's little experiment has left a lasting impression on everyone, himself included. It's a lesson in how sometimes, just sometimes, having a few boundaries isn't the worst thing in the world. If you thought that was wild, wait until you hear what happens next. Brian's feeling a little lost and restless, like something's missing in his life. He's hanging out around the house, nose buried in a book, but even that isn't really distracting him from this feeling. Brian, as we know, is different from everyone else in the Griffin family. He's well-read, a bit of a deep thinker, and he takes pride in being smarter than the average dog. But there's one big thing that's been haunting him. He never finished college. Then, during one of their usual back-and-forth conversations, Peter makes a throwaway comment about how Brian gave up on college. And just like that, the words hit Brian harder than he expected. He tries to shake it off, but it sticks in his mind. He feels like there's unfinished business, that he left something really important behind. And suddenly, he's dead set on going back to school to finally earn that degree. With a new sense of determination, Brian decides to head over to the admissions office at Brown University, where he originally studied. He's nervous, but he feels ready to take this step. But as soon as he walks in, he realizes it won't be easy. When he tells the admissions staff that he's a former student who wants to come back, they're skeptical, to say the least. They've never had a dog apply, let alone one that's returning to complete a degree. The staff members keep throwing obstacles at him, questioning his commitment and reminding him that he dropped out before. But Brian doesn't back down. He argues his case, promising he's serious and won't quit this time. After some back and forth, they finally decide to give him another shot. So, Brian's officially a college student again. At first, he's thrilled. He's back in class, taking notes, and feeling like he's really doing something worthwhile. But it doesn't take long for the reality to sink in. College isn't easy, especially when you've been out of it for a while. The assignments are piling up, the reading load is huge, and every day feels like a marathon of stress and deadlines. Brian's quickly overwhelmed, but he's determined to keep pushing forward. And then, as if things weren't hard enough, Peter decides to support Brian in his own special way. He shows up at Brown, completely uninvited, ready to help Brian succeed. Now, we all know that Peter isn't exactly the picture of focus and maturity. Instead of actually helping Brian, he's causing one distraction after another. Peter treats Brian's college experience like a free vacation for himself, roaming around campus, cracking jokes, and even trying to squeeze himself into Brian's classes. Brian's already struggling, and Peter's constant interruptions are only making things worse. Brian starts to lose patience as Peter's antics get more ridiculous. Imagine this. Brian's trying to study in his dorm, surrounded by textbooks and papers, barely keeping up with his assignments. And then, in comes Peter with a huge grin, acting like it's party time. He's loud, he's clueless, and he has no understanding of how much pressure Brian's under. Peter even drags Brian to campus parties, completely ignoring the fact that Brian's got exams to study for and assignments due. Every time Brian tries to focus, Peter finds a way to mess it up. At one point, Peter even sits in on one of Brian's classes, making a complete spectacle of himself, laughing at things that aren't supposed to be funny and distracting everyone. Brian's mortified, realizing that his dream of a second chance is quickly turning into a nightmare. The stress starts to pile up, and Brian finds himself buried in work, barely able to keep up. He's pulling all-nighters, drinking way too much coffee, and stressing over every little assignment. The pressure's getting to him, and his grades are slipping fast. He feels like he's falling behind, like he's losing control, but he doesn't want to admit it. For Brian, this isn't just about finishing college. It's about proving to himself that he can do it. He doesn't want to be seen as a quitter, especially not after making such a big deal about coming back. But deep down, he's starting to wonder if he made a mistake. Then, everything reaches a breaking point. Brian's got a huge exam coming up, and it's his last chance to prove he's capable of handling the workload. He's spent days cramming for it, trying to absorb every bit of information he can. He knows this test is make or break. If he fails, he's out. So, he's studying harder than ever, shutting out distractions, and trying to focus on nothing but this exam. But Peter, once again, has other plans. Instead of giving Brian the space he needs, Peter decides this is the perfect time to throw a massive party. He invites half the campus, sets up loud music, brings drinks, and turns Brian's room into a full-blown frat party. Brian's sitting there, surrounded by loud, partying students, watching his study space dissolve into chaos. He's furious, feeling like Peter has completely sabotaged his one chance to prove himself. At this point, Brian can't hold back anymore. He finally snaps, yelling at Peter, letting out all his frustration. He tells Peter that he's tired of being treated like a joke, tired of feeling like he can't achieve anything. For Brian, this isn't just about the exam. It's about proving to himself that he's capable, that he's more than just a family dog. He's been working so hard, he apologizes, telling Brian he didn't mean to make things harder, and he quietly leaves, giving Brian the space he needs to study. It's one of those rare moments where Peter actually shows a little bit of understanding and respect for what Brian's going through. The night before the exam, Brian pulls an all-nighter, studying until he can barely keep his eyes open. When the day finally arrives, he walks into the exam room, nervous but determined. He knows he's done everything he can to prepare, and now it's just a matter of doing his best. He sits down, takes a deep breath, and starts working through the questions. It's tough, and there are moments when he doubts himself, but he keeps going, pushing through each problem. When he hands in his exam, he's exhausted. He doesn't know if he passed or failed, but he feels a sense of relief just for finishing. He gave it his all, and that's what matters to him. A few days later, Brian gets his results. He finds out that he passed the exam, and the relief is overwhelming. For Brian, this isn't just a passing grade. It's proof that he's capable, that he can finish what he started. Peter, who's actually proud of Brian for once, pats him on the back and tells him he always knew he could do it. It's a moment of victory, not just academically but personally, as Brian finally proves to himself that he's not a quitter. Quagmire's hosting this nice dinner at his place. Everything's going great until his sister Brenda shows up with this total jerk, Jeff. Now, if you've never seen Brenda before, imagine someone who looks exactly like Quagmire in a dress. Yeah, it's as weird as it sounds. But here's where things get messed up. Everyone notices these bruises all over her face, and she's making up these ridiculous excuses like, I fell down the stairs, or I walked into a door. Come on, Brenda, we weren't born yesterday. Peter, being Peter, handles this situation about as well as a bull in a china shop. He just straight up blurts out, oh my God, he's beating you. Real smooth, right? But honestly, this might be the first time Peter's big mouth actually helped, because it gets everyone talking about the elephant in the room. Now, here's where things start getting really intense. Jeff's not just your regular bad boyfriend. This guy's like a walking red flag factory. He treats Brenda like garbage, constantly puts her down, and gets super aggressive over the smallest things. There's this scene where he freaks out because she didn't get his favorite kind of chips. Who does that? Quagmire's absolutely losing it watching his sister go through this. You can see him struggling, trying to convince Brenda to leave Jeff. But she keeps defending him, saying stuff like, you don't know him like I do, and he can change. It's frustrating to watch, but sadly, this is exactly how these situations often play out in real life. Peter, in his infinite wisdom, decides he's going to fix everything, and oh boy, does he make things worse. First, he tries to set Brenda up with other guys right in front of Jeff. Smooth move, Peter. Then he attempts to give her a makeover to boost her confidence, but ends up making her look like a circus clown. Classic Peter Griffin moment. Trying to help, but causing absolute chaos instead. But wait, it gets better or worse, depending on how you look at it. Peter decides to stage an intervention, and this is where things go completely off the rails. He brings in a bunch of random people who have absolutely nothing to do with the situation, including a guy he met at the grocery store that morning. He even hired a mariachi band to set the mood. Like seriously? Who thinks a mariachi band is appropriate for an intervention about domestic abuse? The intervention turns into a complete disaster when Peter starts acting out scenes from different movies, thinking it'll somehow help. He does his best Jerry Maguire impression, complete with the "you complete me" line, then switches to "a few good men" and starts yelling, "You can't handle the truth" at Brenda. Meanwhile, everyone else is just sitting there, completely mortified. But here's where things take a serious turn. Jeff finds out about the intervention and completely loses it. He starts threatening everyone, and for once, even Peter realizes this isn't something he can joke his way out of. The mood in the room changes faster than Peter can say giggity, which, by the way, Quagmire doesn't say even once in this episode. That's how serious it is. The situation gets so bad that Quagmire, Joe, and Peter finally decide they need to take matters into their own hands. They plan to take Jeff on a fishing trip to talk some sense into him. But because this is Peter we're talking about, he can't help but turn it into a complete circus. He shows up in full fishing gear, including one of those hats with hooks all over it, and somehow manages to get himself tangled in his own fishing line before they even leave the driveway. During the car ride, Peter keeps trying to lighten the mood by singing sea shanties and telling fish puns. He's got this whole routine about something's fishy about this situation that makes everyone in the car want to throw him overboard, and they haven't even reached any water yet. The confrontation with Jeff turns into this huge mess, partly because Peter can't stop making inappropriate jokes at the worst possible moments. There's this intense standoff, and what does Peter do? He starts doing his impression of the Gorton's fisherman. Like, read the room, Peter. The episode ends on a more serious note, with Brenda finally realizing she deserves better. But Peter, being Peter, can't help but try to end things on a light note by suggesting they all go get ice cream and forget this whole thing ever happened. It all started on a seemingly ordinary day in the Griffin household. Peter was lounging on the couch, remote in hand, when Stewie strutted into the room with a mischievous grin. "Hey, Peter," the devious toddler began. "I've been thinking. I'm a pretty good driver, you know. Maybe you could let me take the car for a spin." Now, anyone with a shred of common sense would have immediately shut that idea down. But, of course, this is Peter Griffin we're talking about. A driver's license? Who needs one of those? He chuckled, tossing the keys to Stewie. "Just don't wreck the car, all right?" With keys in hand, Stewie gleefully bounded out to the driveway, Peter hot on his heels. "All right, Stewie, let's see what you've got," Peter exclaimed, settling into the passenger seat. Stewie fired up the engine and took off, weaving through the neighborhood streets like a Formula One driver. At first, it seemed like Stewie might actually pull this off. He navigated the turns and stop signs with surprising skill, leaving Peter impressed. "Hey, kid, you're not half bad," Peter shouted over the roar of the engine. But wasn't long before things started to go downhill. Stewie spotted an ice cream truck a few blocks away and, without warning, gunned the accelerator, careening towards the unsuspecting vendor. Peter's eyes went wide as he braced for impact. "Stewie, no. Slow down," he pleaded. But it was too late. The car slammed into the ice cream truck with a sickening crunch, sending frozen treats and debris flying in all directions. Peter and Stewie emerged from the wreckage, covered in melted ice cream and shaken, but miraculously unharmed. "Oops," Stewie muttered, surveying the damage. As the stunned ice cream man stumbled from his truck, Peter knew they were in big trouble. Oh, Stewie, I think we're going to need a lawyer for this one," he said, his voice trembling. The two quickly jumped back into the car and sped off, leaving the chaos behind them. From there, the situation only spiraled further out of control. Stewie's driving antics continued, with the tiny terror careening through intersections, plowing through flower beds, and even taking out a mailbox or two. Peter, meanwhile, sat white-knuckled in the passenger seat, alternating between panic and futile attempts to regain control of the situation. By the time they finally pulled back into the Griffin driveway, the car was a mess, and Peter and Stewie were both a nervous wreck. Lois greeted them at the door, her expression a mix of disbelief and exasperation. "Peter, what on earth happened?" she asked, surveying the damage. Well, you see, Lois," Peter stammered. "Stewie's a natural behind the wheel. We were just, testing his skills." "Yeah, that's it." Lois narrowed her eyes, clearly not buying it. "Peter, I've told you a million times. Stewie is not allowed to drive. Now clean up this mess before the neighbors see it." Peter and Stewie reluctantly set to work, their tails firmly tucked between their legs. As they scrubbed and swept, Peter couldn't help but wonder, how on earth am I going to explain this one to the insurance company?
Give these kids their dog back.
Of course, sir. I'm so sorry.
Well, there you have it. One of the worst, most cringe-worthy moments for Peter Griffin. If you enjoyed this recap, be sure to check out our next video, where we'll dive into another Family Guy episode that will have you questioning Peter's sanity. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it.